CEO, Mr. Howard, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the generous introduction. It was more than generous. When you receive as a speaker an introduction like that, you're best to sit down and say nothing. I was asked to speak at a dinner in Melbourne last month. They said wear a black tie. I drove into an underground car park near the dinner and hopped into the lift. There was a young girl there, maybe 20, and a boyfriend, nobody else. The lift was slow starting and we got talking. I said, "You're very smartly dressed." She said, "Yes," she said, "I'm a singer and I'm going to the Mayfair bar." Not being part of nightlife in Melbourne, all I could say is, "That's wonderful." She looked at me and she said, "You're a bit dressed up too." The lift was about to stop and we were about to get out. I couldn't explain. I said, "I'm singing too." They'd only gone a few paces away, and just within earshot, she turned to her boyfriend and she said, "Wow," she said, "isn't he a bit old to be singing tonight?" So you've redeemed my reputation. Yeah. I'm speaking about democracy in a wide sense, and we'll come back to Australia. It's a very interesting time in international relations, and I hesitate to speak in the presence of two former Prime Ministers and so many other distinguished guests. But in the last few months there's been talk of a trade war between the United States and China and maybe much of the world, and there's been excited discussion of the fact that President Li of China has been made president for life. Not being a China watcher, I don't know what to make of that appointment, but it's quite possible that it's not of unusual significance in a communist country. They're going to be there for life unless somebody stops them. He obviously has keen memories of China in the last 20 years of Chairman Mao's custodianship of the terrible trouble he led China into, the famine which was not only caused by climate but by maladministration, the Cultural Revolution, which was really cultural chaos, the reign of the Red Guards. You can understand leaders wondering what will happen to my succession and perhaps doing something positive about it. I thought the other day, it's only in the last 70 years that another world power was seen as rising rapidly, just as China has been rising in the last 30 years. In 1945, to the surprise of so many in the world, the Soviet Union emerged as a world power, and yet in the 1920s and the 1930s, so many people thought that that was inconceivable. But the Soviet Union performed so well in the war against Germany, had ambitions and soon fulfilled them to create nuclear weapons, had won a huge territory which was soon followed by the victory of the Chinese Communists in 1949, so that by 1950 the map of Asia and Europe was astonishing. There was a communist bloc, a communist zone stretching from Hong Kong and the east coast of Siberia all the way to the Italian border. And here was this huge communist zone which people interested in international affairs said, this is an incredible sight with two such populous and powerful communist nations. What's going to happen to democracy? But lo and behold, the two communist nations were soon quarrelling, and by 1960 I think most of the huge number of Russians who were in China were expelled and seen there no more. But people were very worried, even though the United States facing those two communist countries, even though the United States was incredibly powerful in its economy and incredibly powerful militarily, but there was a great sense of worry for many years in the Western world, and it was heightened when Russia put the first person into space. It was heightened immeasurably in 1962 when President Kennedy was reigning in the United States and the missile crisis in Cuba erupted, and I think it was probably the most alarming few weeks in the world since 1945, the fear that from Cuba Russian missiles might land in New York, but that conference was resolved. I, of course, have got no idea what will happen to the relationships between China and the United States in the next 20 years. It's in the hands of the gods. But I think the situation in 1945, on present evidence, for the Western world and for democracies, was much more perilous than it is today. Of course, situations can quickly become more perilous than they are at present. I imagine that if relations between the democratic powers and China deteriorate and Australia becomes more nervous about China's policies in this part of the world, that the Australian government will eventually have to make decisions. Which side are we on, or are we going to walk the tightrope? Inevitably, countries have to make those decisions. My feeling is that given the immense power of China and the United States compared to Australia, and no matter what decision we might make, it might soon be reversed by a decision that's made in Washington or a decision that's made in Beijing. I think we like to think, and we all write history barracking for our own nation, we like to think that at some of the crucial points in our history we've had an influence on world events rather larger than in fact it was. And some of you will remember reading, and I can remember it because I used to deliver heralds in 1942, the Melbourne newspaper, when John Curtin wrote his famous article, a brave Prime Minister in the Second World War, and he appealed to the United States for help. At that time, Britain was our great ally. I'm not sure whether the article did Mr. Curtin much good, but it's widely believed in Australian schools that Mr. Curtin helped persuade the United States to come to our aid at that most perilous stage in the war in the Pacific. Of course, the United States had long before decided to come to Australia's aid. Indeed, even before Christmas 1941, just a fortnight after Pearl Harbor, American convoys on their way to the Philippines with war materials, no hope of landing safely in the Philippines where the Japanese were already entrenched. Those convoys were diverted to Brisbane. So that naturally we like to think that we have power at these turning points, but often we don't have the power. I heard people discussing this question on the radio the other day and discussing it very well. They said Australia's links with China are so powerful and at the moment so friendly that this should help us if any crisis arose. Our links to the United States are also very powerful and wide-ranging and much longer. I think of the situation in 1914. It was widely believed then that nations which had strong links with one another would certainly not go to war on the eve of the Second World War. It was said that Germany and England had very close relations, and in some senses Germany and England had closer relations than any two major powers in Europe in 1914. There were also a great network of personal relations, and we know that Kaiser Wilhelm, the ruler and very powerful in Germany in 1914, was the grandson of Queen Victoria, so famous in England. And we know that the wife of the German ambassador in Paris, such a powerful position in 1914, the wife of the German ambassador in Paris, her brother was the personal secretary to Lord Grey, the British Foreign Secretary. We know that the chief of the German army in 1914, the most powerful army in the world, had sent his daughter relatively recently to a girls' boarding school in England. And in intellectual circles and religious circles, the links between Germany and Britain was so extensive and so intimate. But in the end, the two countries went to war on the opposite sides. So we can never be certain, no matter how much goodwill and friendship is, we can never be certain how the cards actually play out. There's a belief, if by chance the situation should deteriorate, I'm optimistic because I won't be here by the time it happens, having met that girl in the lift. Some people, I think, are unduly optimistic. There's a widespread view in Australia. I would think it occupies the minds of about 10 or 15% of the population who are really interested in foreign affairs. There's a widespread belief that if the international situation should deteriorate and that Australia would have to make up its mind whether it would support China or support the United States, that we could avoid that decision by declaring ourselves neutral. That view is often stated, but you can only declare yourself neutral in an international crisis with the consent of the other power. You know, in the last 100 years, many nations have declared themselves neutral, but the nation that was going to conquer them went straight ahead, saying you've made it so much easier. That really, to me, is a most naive argument, and yet it's widely held, and I believe it's close to being the policy of one political party. There is also a school of thought, and I've seen the leading academics put it forward, that Australia should never go in the future into another war without Parliament debating the matter. That Parliament should be called while the crisis is on, and Parliament should debate it, and the troops should remain in their barracks, because it would be unfair on the decision-making if they left the barracks or left their naval bases until the debate was completed. That seems to me to be an unrealistic idea. If you have an ally, you've made the decision to help them in certain situations long before the crisis arises. Otherwise, you're not a worthwhile ally. Just before concluding in this territory, a word about alliances. If you're a middle-ranking power, or not quite a middle-ranking power, you really have to have allies if the world's in a difficult situation. I think Australia's been one of the more fortunate countries in modern history. We had a very powerful ally in Britain at the time when it ruled the seas. We had very good relationships with Britain over a long period of time. Relationships with allies are never perfect, and there are always quarrels, and sometimes when Australia was the junior, much the junior partner in the alliance, Australia had its own foreign policy and did exactly what it wanted. That's why we had Papua New Guinea for such a long period. But the alliances, I think, are often difficult. Some of you will remember, or some of you will have read the situation in the late 1930s. Britain and France were strong allies. Technically, militarily, they were much stronger than Nazi Germany, but Nazi Germany invaded France in 1940. In the space of a couple of days, ran over the territory which was deadlocked in battle for nearly 4 years of the First World War, and before long the Germans were on the edge of Paris, and military movements by the French were hampered by the fact that French civilians were fleeing in such huge numbers that the roads were blocked. There was a brief period where the French demanded that Britain, their faithful ally, should give them more aid on the ground and on the air, but by then Churchill had wisely come to the conclusion that the French were divided and that they were not going to win this war. And part of his greatness was realising that situation and keeping sufficient strength in Britain for them to win the next stage, the battle for Britain. But the collapse of France was one of the terrible events. I don't think there's been a similar event in the history of modern democracy. France, one of the great nations in the world, an ornament to democracy, collapsing in the matter of weeks at the hands of its traditional foe, Germany. And the consequences of the collapse of that alliance were proud. As a nation, we've tended to forget that in 1939, the British plan was that should Germany enter the war, And a little later, should Japan enter the Second World War, the French Navy, a strong navy, would command the Mediterranean and the North Sea and the Atlantic, while the British Navy, if it had time, would go either through the Suez Canal or past the Cape of Good Hope to Singapore and defend Singapore. Of course, once France was conquered, that was the end of that plan. But Singapore was in a hopeless position as soon as the French Navy was no longer in British hands. In the end, Britain did send the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, but they had no air cover, and that was one of the terrible events in the history of the British Empire. And Churchill, as Prime Minister, thought, I can't think of anything like this when the news came through that those two great warships had been sunk by the Japanese in December 1941, soon after the war began. And so there was an alliance that seemed so firm Australia was part of, and when that alliance broke down, Australia was in a perilous position in all the Australian summer, the southern summer of 1941-1942. Fortunately, we were saved more by Kokoda, but Kokoda is a great event in Australian history, a great episode in the bravery of people inexperienced in war who held up the Japanese in that mountainous country. Likewise, the Battle of Mill Bay is a great event in our history, but the Battle of the Coral Sea, in the eyes of all international students of war, was an infinitely more important event. That first battle in naval history where the two fleets didn't really sight each other, but the aircraft did, and the aircraft did the damage. That used to be greatly commemorated in Australia. I think every city commemorated the Battle of the Coral Sea, but now I don't think it is a great national celebration, except in Canberra. I think it's in the nature of us as human beings that we don't like to be grateful for too long, and we would sooner be grateful to our own countrymen than to the countrymen from far away. I don't say that as a criticism. So alliances are all important to Australia, but you can never be certain in certain situations whether the alliance is adequate. What's the state of democracy in the world? It's fairly clear that if China becomes the great power, and militarily, of course, to my knowledge, China is not the number one power at present, but if China becomes a great power, both in economic life and in military life, it will have a lot of effect on independent nations. And China has made it quite clear that they don't believe in democracy, they don't believe in an independent judiciary, they're not too keen on international courts if they deliver the wrong verdict, as they did on those little islands in the South China Sea. All this is understandable, of course, in international relations. But quite clearly, just as the United States was a great force for persuading nations to be democratic, so if China becomes powerful, that will be a great force working against democracy. What's the state of democracy in the world at the moment? It's very hard to add up these things, but some people are brave enough to add them up. You can find here and there lists of the nations of the world which can be called democrats and those which quite clearly are not. I think perhaps the best list I've seen was provided by the Economist newspaper or magazine Intelligence Unit. It was compiled in 2017 and it lists what it considers the real democracies of the world. You can criticise these lists, and I would criticise many facets of it, but if you're brave enough to go to the trouble and you produce something that's reasonably believable, that's a great achievement. I think they said there are 167 nations in the world, nearly all of them, almost all of them members of the United Nations, and it said the pure democracies number only 19. The list started, I think, with Norway, Iceland, Sweden, and to our dismay, New Zealand. And then it went on with Australia in number 8. Britain and Germany were further down the list. And a few very small countries crept in. To my surprise, Mauritius was in the list. They're nearly all wealthy countries, but here's Mauritius, which an island in the Indian Ocean is certainly not a wealthy country. Most of the countries on that list were prosperous countries. None of them had a high population except Germany and Britain, and yet Germany and Britain no longer have high populations by world standards. They wouldn't be in the top 15, would they, now that you look at the latest African statistics? But that was the list they compiled. To my astonishment, and their categories are wide, they included not only parliamentary processes, electoral processes, the level of corruption, the rule of law, toleration of rivals. They concluded that the United States was not on the top list. They had 19 at the top. I think they put the United States 21 and South Korea 20. I'm inclined on their own categories that they would have to put the United States in the top 19. Why they should have only 19 in the top seems to me surprising when you have 167 nations. Then they moved on and they categorised the second group. These were democracies. You could definitely call them democracies, they said, but they were defective. The word they used was flawed, F-L-A-W-E-D. And that list ran from number 20, which was South Korea, to about number 76. To my surprise, number 75 on the list was Papua New Guinea, which is, it's a deserved place. It's very much to Australia's credit that having taken over that territory and subsidised it on a substantial scale over so many years, has put PNG in a position that great numbers of African nations are nowhere near. They then went on to list countries. They call them hybrid democracies. It's the kind of term the economists would use. It's linked to the stock exchange. These hybrid countries ran from about the number 76 to 119. The hybrid countries included a lot of respectable countries. They were then followed by, the hybrid countries were a mixture of democracy and authoritarianism. And then came the next list, which had about 50 nations in it, and these were simply authoritarian nations. It's not a very nice picture of the world at the moment that 50 nations are what you could call authoritarian nations. At the bottom of the list was North Korea. At the top of in the middle of the list were Russia and China and United Arab Emirates. They were ranked around number 140 in the list of 167. One doesn't have to accept the list, but it's an interesting statement that while we're often told that democracy is winning the battle, and the number of democracies in the world have startlingly increased in the last 70 years, the majority of countries in the world cannot be called democracies or even hybrid democracies. They're a bit lower down the level than that. There are no Islamic nations in a favourable position on the list of democracies. The day may come when Islamic nations occupy one of the top 40 or more positions. It's far from impossible. Some of you will have read how Turkey, very much an authoritarian nation in the First World War, underwent a revolution under Ataturk in the 1920s, and Turkey started to go some way towards democracy and reduced very much the power of Islam, elevated very much the status of women, and people thought that here's an infant democracy arising out of Gallipoli. But as Ataturk became more powerful, Ataturk decided that he should decide who should stand for Parliament and made other decisions of importance, so that the sight of Turkey becoming a democracy gradually diminished. There's no reason why ultimately, over a long period of time, Islamic countries can't become democracies of high standing, but there's not much sign of it at the moment. Most of the countries, let's say the top 30 in that list of the more democratic nations, the typical nation is prosperous, not with a large population, usually with an ageing population, and usually with a high level of social cohesion. There are two in that early list that started out without social cohesion and have gained it. Switzerland obviously started out without social cohesion with the German-speaking, the Italian-speaking, the French-speaking populations, and with the big rift between the Calvinists and the Zwinglians and, on the other hand, the Catholics. And here was this divided nation working its way up, so it's one of the star democracies of the world. And interestingly, Mauritius is in that top list, and Mauritius, I think, had a divided background. It had the local populations, and then the French came in, and then Britain conquered in the Napoleonic Wars Mauritius, so that it had a variety of cultures and a substantial division between the English-speaking and the French-speaking, but here is Mauritius, in the eyes of independent judges, one of the democracies in the world. So this gives you hope that over a long period of time, countries which don't show much likelihood of becoming democracies can, with the right influence, work their way forward. I must watch the time. I'll go down back to my script, which I've taken the liberty of deviating from, since I have the only copy. Could I just say a word briefly about Christianity? Christianity is much more a seedbed of democracy than Islam. That may change. One doesn't know what the countries that are still presently Christian will be in 100 years' time, whether they will be more secular or will they be more Christian. I'm inclined to think myself that Christianity has declined so often in the past that you don't necessarily need to see this decline as a lasting decline. The reason why there have been so many religious revivals in the long history of Christianity is that there have been so many periods of decline. And therefore I'm not sure that the prediction that Christianity is in terminal decline is correct. After all, it was widely predicted, and especially in universities 50 years ago, that Islam was in permanent decline. And Islam has shown that it's not in permanent decline and is in a very powerful position in many parts of the world. So that ideas are often very difficult to predict, and I sometimes try to predict them, but I know I'm doing it at my peril. But Christianity did have considerable seeds of democracy in it. It's notable that when the Reformation and the Renaissance came, there were great Catholic challengers of the status quo. Erasmus, I think you'd have to say, was the Einstein of the 16th century. Being in the humanities and the social sciences, he wouldn't get marks today, but he certainly had a mind that was immensely powerful compared to his contemporaries, in the same way that Einstein, if I understand his contemporaries, was given credit for. But it was certain sects of Protestantism that pushed the world towards democracy in small parts of Europe. The Calvinists, while they had strong strands of autocracy in them, the Calvinists led a strong push towards democracy. They believed that everybody should read the Bible. And if they were going to read the Bible, they'd have to go to school. And that was a radical idea. So that the most educated countries in Europe at one period were the Calvinist countries. And the Calvinists, while in many ways hierarchical, believed that everybody was entitled to their own interpretation, the priesthood of all believers, so that there were sects that definitely pushed the world, or sections of the world, towards Protestantism. I think Protestantism and Catholicism in the modern world have also tended to have a sympathy towards democracy and a strong suspicion of dictatorships, not always, but a strong suspicion of dictatorships. They believe that humility and humanity are virtues. Of course, it's much more difficult to carry it out, but that's their belief. And if you believe that humility and humanity are virtues, you don't think so highly of dictatorships, and you're quicker than others to see signs of an emerging dictatorship. I'll finish with a few more words on Christianity. I should say something about the European Union and the United Nations. The European Union is an experiment in democracy. It's obviously much harder for a cluster of nations to form a democratic framework than it is for an individual nation. The European Union is a brave experiment, and it's remarkable that a continent which was so often at war since 1945 has largely avoided war, with the exception of the Balkans. But it's had its great successes, and obviously the bringing together of the economies was much easier. The bringing together on a wider scale has been much harder, and there can be no doubt that the European Union in the last 25 years has not had the successes that seemed likely if you looked at it back in 1990. What will become of it, we don't know, but it's had more successes than failures. One fact is unmistakable. Since the European Union began, Europe has slid in importance as a political power, and I think people would find it in 1945 inconceivable that Europe as a whole has so much less influence on the world than it had in the previous century. Of course, that may alter. One could also say a word about another clustering of nations. That's a more difficult task, to bring all the nations of the world into one group. But the United Nations bravely set about doing that in 1945, and it's been infinitely more successful than its predecessor, the League of Nations. But it's a very difficult task to combine the great powers and the tiny powers in the one organisation, and to give some the veto and to give others a vote larger than they deserve and others a vote smaller than they deserve. It's noteworthy that amongst the 5 permanent members, once you take away the 5 permanent members of the powerful Security Council, you find 3 very populous nations, India, Indonesia and Brazil, without a seat, but they're, 3 of the 5 most populous nations in the world. If my reading of population statistics is correct, it's possible that by the late 2020s, India will become the most populous nation in the world. It will have to be given a seat, I would think, on the Security Council. But the United Nations has had its merits, and the day will come, 2 centuries or 3 centuries hence, perhaps earlier, when an attempt will be made, probably using the United Nations framework, to set up a world government. It may be set up by conquest, or it may be set up by negotiation. It probably will fail at the first attempt, but one would be mistaken if one stood here and thought that's not a possibility of a future which none of us here will know. Democracy in Australia. I must press on so there's time for questions. I'll be brief. Democracy in Australia, as you know, is a triumph. Many people say it isn't, All kinds of criticisms can be made of democracy, but overall it's a triumph. Here is one of the oldest continuous democracies in the world. A lot of old democracies would be more continuous but for Hitler. In 1850, democracy barely had a toehold in this land. We were ruled by governors. But within a decade, democracy became powerful, though not yet in Western Australia. It was still receiving convicts at the time of the gold rushes. The new parliaments in Australia were elected by a far larger section of the population here than in England or almost any other country. South Australia is actually the leader in a high proportion of democratic reforms. New South Wales and Victoria often claim to have been the leader, but the evidence is strongly in South Australia's favour. South Australia was the first to introduce manhood suffrage, a vote for every man, long before most infant democracies in the world dreamed of going that far. And who could stand for the lower house of Parliament? In England and most countries you had to own property. But South Australia abolished this requirement. You could stand for Parliament without owning anything in 1856, and soon after 3 other mainland colonies did the same. In a typical election everywhere in the world, in the early 1850s, voting was open. On the day of the election, or the 2 days of the election, you went up to the man who was in charge of the rolls and you said, I wanted to vote. And you voted and the vote was announced. And if the employer was there and he didn't like the way you'd voted, well, lo and behold. Sometimes if the voting was close, people with a lot of money would hurry around the town finding potential voters and giving them a night in the hotel before they delivered their vote under the watchful eye of the subsidiser. It was a very difficult system to operate. The secret ballot was first practiced in Australia, one of the great inventions in the history of democracy. Victoria was the first to introduce it. South Australia passed it through Parliament 2 weeks later. Around the world, when eventually the United States and Canada and England and country after country adopted the secret ballot, they called it the Australian ballot. Some who knew where Victoria was called it the Victorian ballot. In South Australia they knew better and called it the South Australian ballot. It was a remarkable performance for such a young country, and when you think of how few people there were in the land who had any experience of democracy, I suppose there was nobody in Australia, I stand correction, in the 1850s who had sat in the House of Commons. And here democracy worked with surprisingly little corruption. Another wave of democracy, and I'll end my discussion of democracy here, began in the 1890s. The most revolutionary idea was votes for women. New Zealand led the way, the first country in the world to give women the vote. A year later, South Australia came second. When the first federal parliament was created in 1901, one of its early decisions was who should vote, and Australia became the first country in the world to give women the right to vote and the right to stand for Parliament. I think that was in the federal election of 1903, a momentous election in the history of democracy. Interestingly, the women played a vital role in gaining the right to vote, especially in South Australia. The organisation that was most influential was called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It had great difficulty at first. The rule in the 19th century was that women did not speak in public. Women did not preach in church. I think the only church in Australia at that time, which sometimes allowed women to preach, was the Bible Christian Church, a breakaway from the Methodists. The Bible Christians were very strong in South Australia. Their stronghold overseas was in Cornwall and Devon. They were a small sect. My own father was baptised as a Bible Christian just before they were gobbled up by the stronger branches of the Methodist Church. The Bible Christians allowed women to preach in church. But when women of education and learning with something to say decided to go to a literary society or to a public place, they did not, as a rule, read their own paper. Often they did not attend, entrusting a man to read the paper. Women did not speak in public in most circumstances. One of the great workers for women's rights was Catherine Helen Spence, a South Australian, an early novelist. When she came back from a trip to Europe and being very observant and very bright, saw so many things that she thought the intellectuals of South Australia would like to know, she decided that she would give a paper, and eventually for her next paper she would speak. And she was so nervous that her friend Sir Samuel Way, later the Chief Justice, a Bible Christian by the way, stood at the back of the audience, smiling and waving to her to give her confidence. She felt so proud that she had achieved that most unwomanly action. She said one of the great moments of her life, she was a Unitarian by religion, and at the Adelaide Unitarian Church, a woman came over from Melbourne and conducted the service. And she thought it was one of the most uplifting experiences of her life, because she thought women could do some things better than men. And so there came this remarkable miracle led by Australia. I could say more about Australia, but I must finish. I don't need to dwell on the advantages of democracy. One of the assets of a real democracy is that it has a high chance of avoiding civil war. Democracy has a high chance of avoiding civil war. It possesses a culture and a formula for solving internal disputes. We don't realise how deadly civil war has been. Since 1945, I think civil war in the world has caused far more deaths than wars between nations. Civil war has caused far more deaths than wars between nations. A way of abolishing civil war is a great gain for humanity. Civil war in China in the late 1940s, in the Indian subcontinent at the same time, in Indonesia in the mid-1960s, each killed more than 500,000 people. Later, the African civil wars in Sudan, Uganda, Ethiopia and Mozambique have each killed more than 500,000 people. And some of these civil wars have actually killed more than 1 million people. And I'm only drawing from a very long list of deadly civil wars. Even Syria's civil war has probably cost close to 250,000 lives. I suppose that judgment will later be altered when people know more about what's really happened, but that's what the estimate is given by many people, and it's not yet over. The other great advantage of democracy, and it has many advantages, is that it can undermine dictators. A democracy has an eye, not always, for an emerging dictator. Democracy, whether in ancient Athens or in our world during the last 2 centuries, was a brave response to tyrants and dictators. I think democracy, you may disagree, embodies an insight into human nature. Herodotus, a Greek, perhaps the first famous historian, wrote that people holding too much power for too long become proud and contemptible of their citizens. His exact words were, "Pride precedes the fall. Pride precedes the fall. If people with great power become too proud, they're on their way down, but they'll do an enormous amount of damage before they fall." The Old Testament and the New Testament often preach a vivid version of the same warning. Lord Acton, who was a friend and advisor of W.E. Gladstone, for long a Prime Minister of England, had studied history intensely. He owned a library of 59,000 books, and in thousands of them he wrote comments in ink. In our generation, we didn't write our comments in ink, only in pencil, on books we owned or books we borrowed from the library. A zealous Catholic, he had studied all kinds of people in power, including popes in a long-distance time, and he did not exempt them from his scrutiny. He died in 1902, not far from Munich, the German city which was to become Hitler's stamping ground. Acton wrote in a private letter, most of you know this quotation, it's often given as "power corrupts," but he didn't quite say that. Lord Acton said power tends to corrupt. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was writing not only about powerful rulers, he wrote this in a private letter, and it was discovered, I think, just before or just after his death. He was not writing only about powerful rulers, but about all kinds of human beings, whether scientists, doctors, admirals, bishops, businessmen, even historians, and of course people in their personal family life. Lord Acton, who died in 1902, did not live to see the rise to power of young Adolf Hitler and young Joseph Stalin, both alive and well in the Europe of Acton's day. He did not live to see how powerful they became and ultimately how tyrannical and cruel. Acton's insight was very much a Christian insight. Democracy has often been the strong enemy of dictatorship. Not always. A democracy sometimes can't see a dictator in the making. Hitler came to power largely by popular vote and did the rest. A lot of Hitler's vote came from devout Lutherans in the northern part of Germany. Mussolini came to power by popular vote and after a while saw no need for parliament. It's not easy to pick a democracy, to pick a potential dictator, no matter what their writings might have indicated. So democracy is the strong enemy of dictatorship. It sees warning signs. That's why it was crucial in defending civilization in the 20th century, and will be again. All honour to Paul Ramsay for making one of the most generous donations in Australian history. He believed that Western civilization, for all its failures, all human creations have failures, he believed that for all its failures, it's had something important to say and should at times be protected and should above all be studied. All best wishes in your quest.